The sky burned like fire and the stars looked angry as a small ship crashed into the side of a green mountain and smoke rose like a signal to the whole galaxy. And inside the ship a young human soldier opened his eyes and pain hit him like a wave. But he pushed himself up and looked around and knew he was not on Earth. His name was Jack, and he had been fighting in the war for too long, and he was tired and broken and now lost on an unknown planet far away from everything he ever knew, and the war had chased him even here and now. He was alone with nothing but his broken gear and a beating heart. The air was clean and the sky was wide and the planet looked calm, but Jack knew better because nothing stayed peaceful for long in this galaxy, and still he walked away from the crash with slow steps and blood on his arm and a sharp fear in his chest. Then he saw her. She was small and strange with glowing silver skin and wide purple eyes and thin hair that floated like it was underwater, and she stood in front of him without fear like she had been waiting. And Jack raised his hands and tried to speak, but the girl just tilted her head and smiled. He asked if she spoke his language and she just nodded once and then turned and walked into the trees, and Jack followed because he had no other choice. And she moved fast like she belonged here, and maybe she did, and maybe this was her home, and maybe he was just a ghost passing through. She led him to a cave where the air was warm and safe, and inside there were small glowing plants and soft stone walls, and Jack sat down with a heavy breath, and the girl handed him something like a fruit, and it tasted sweet and full of life, and for the first time in a long time he smiled. He asked her name and she said Lyra in a voice like music, and she sat next to him and asked about the stars and the war and Earth, and he told her stories of blue oceans and busy cities, and she listened with wide eyes and hands on her knees, and he forgot for a moment that he was a soldier, and she forgot for a moment that he was from a world full of fire days past. And Jack healed slowly, and Lyra came every day and brought food and strange toys and taught him her words, and he taught her jokes, and once she laughed so hard that the cave echoed with the sound, and Jack laughed too, and the pain in his chest felt smaller. One day she asked if humans marry, and Jack laughed and said yes, and she asked how, and he said they promised to stay together forever, and Lyra looked confused and said forever is a long time, and Jack said yes, but it is also short when you are with the right person, and she thought about that and nodded like she understood. Then she looked at him with a serious face and said, I will marry you when I grow up, and Jack laughed loud and held his stomach and said that would be funny, and he said, okay little alien girl, when you grow up you can marry me, and she smiled like he had given her the stars, and her eyes glowed a little brighter, and he thought she was just a child and would forget, and so he laughed and forgot too, but Lyra never forgot. That day a signal came through the wreckage and Jack was rescued by a human ship, and before he left he saw Lyra watching from the trees, and he waved and she waved back, and the moment froze in time like a dream made of light years passed like wind, and Jack returned to Earth, and then to war, and then to silence and peace, and then to a quiet farm where he worked alone and watched the sky, and sometimes thought about a small alien girl with purple eyes and a smile that made caves laugh. He never saw her again, at least that is what he believed, but in the stars someone was growing and learning and remembering and waiting, and she held the promise like a flame in her hand, and every day she whispered to herself, I will find him, because a joke is just a joke until someone remembers. And Lyra remembered. The wind moved slowly across the quiet Earth farm, and Jack stood alone in the field with his hands in the soil and the morning sun behind him and the sound of birds calling from far away, and for a moment everything felt peaceful, like the war had never happened and the stars had never burned and the screams of battle were just old echoes from another life. He wiped the sweat from his face and looked at the sky and wondered how long this peace would last, because peace always felt like a thin shell over fire, and Jack had seen too much to believe it would last forever, and in the silence he often heard the memory of voices that no longer spoke and names that no longer lived. That was when the sky changed. A sharp line of light cut through the clouds and something heavy shook the ground, and the animals ran without sound, and Jack turned quickly with a rush in his chest like a warning, and he saw the ship landing not far from the edge of the woods with a smooth silver body and no markings and no noise and no signal. His hands reached for a weapon that was not there, because this was not the war and he was not a soldier anymore, and still his body moved like it remembered how to fight and how to run and how to survive, and he walked slowly toward the ship with his heart beating faster than it should and 1,000 thoughts spinning inside his head. The door of the ship opened with a soft sound like a breath, and a figure stepped out with grace and silence, and Jack stopped in his tracks because what he saw did not fit with what he expected, and his breath caught in his throat like it was trying to hide. She was tall and calm, and her skin shimmered with silver light, and her eyes glowed like stars seen through water, and her hair floated around her head like it lived in a dream, and her steps were soft but strong, and when she looked at him he felt a weight in his chest that he did not understand. Then she spoke. You promised to marry me. Jack blinked and tried to speak, but the words would not come, because her voice sounded like music he had forgotten, and her face looked like someone from a story he once told himself when he was broken and hiding in a cave on a world that never left his mind, and his knees felt weak, like he had walked into a memory that had grown up without him. She stepped closer and smiled with a small tilt of her head, and her voice came again softer this time. You said when I grow up, and now I have grown. Jack finally found his voice and said it was just a joke, and She nodded and said yes, but I was a child and I did not know how to forget. And when someone gives you a promise, you hold it with both hands and carry it through the stars. He stared at her, trying to understand, and asked how she found him, and she looked toward the sky and said, I never stopped searching, and the stars remember more than people think, and the universe has strange ways of keeping promises, and now I am here and I need your help. Jack asked, what kind of help? And her smile faded, and a shadow passed through her eyes like a storm behind glass, and she said, my world is in danger and the enemy has returned, and you are the only one who can stop what is coming. He laughed without joy and said, I am not a hero and I am not the man you remember. And she said, you were never a hero to me, you were just kind, and kindness lasts longer than war, and you made a promise, and sometimes a promise is not just words, it is a path. The wind grew stronger and the ship behind her pulsed with quiet light, and Jack felt the pull of the stars again, the same pull that took him from Earth once and brought him back, and now it was calling again, and this time it was not war, it was something else, something he could not name. He looked at her again and saw both the little girl and the grown woman, and the years between them and the hope she carried like a flame in her chest. And he thought about the world she came from and the cave that once held his pain and her laughter, and how that moment had changed her life. He asked her name again and she said, Lyra, and he whispered it like a secret, and she smiled like it was the word she had waited to hear for years, and Jack felt something old inside him begin to move like a door opening after a long time. He looked at the sky one last time and then back at her and said, take me there. She nodded and turned toward the ship, and he followed without another word, because some promises do not die, and some jokes are not jokes, and some stories do not end, they just wait, and the stars were waiting. The ship moved through space like a silent bird flying through an endless sky, and Jack stood near the window looking at the stars that now felt closer than his own memories, and beside him Lyra watched with calm eyes like she had seen 1,000 worlds and carried the weight of each one in her heart. The stars blinked like quiet witnesses, and Jack wondered how many of them had seen the things he had seen, and how many had forgotten him already. And the silence of space was different than the silence of Earth, because this silence felt alive, like it was breathing and waiting. He turned to Lyra and asked why him, and what made her believe he could help. When he had left war behind, and she walked to a panel on the wall and placed her hand on it, and the metal moved like liquid and opened to reveal a strange glowing sphere floating in the air. She said, this is the heart of memory, and only you can unlock it. And Jack asked again why him, and Lyra looked into his eyes with the truth written across her face like a song that hurt to sing, and she said, because you touched it once long ago, and it chose you. Jack stepped closer, and the sphere began to pulse with light and hum like it knew him, and the air around it felt heavy like a storm just before the first drop of rain. And Lyra said, your body carries a mark left by the relic, and it makes you more than human. Now he reached toward it but stopped because his hand trembled, and he remembered the war and the lives lost and the face of a friend who did not make it back, and he asked, what happens if I touch it again? And Lyra said, then the truth will open and the danger will begin. And Jack placed his hand on the sphere, and light wrapped around his fingers like vines of energy, and his eyes turned white for a moment, and his body froze as visions filled his mind, and he saw Lyra's planet covered in darkness and strange machines feeding on life, and a voice inside his head spoke with power. The voice said, welcome back, keeper of the promise. The time has come to awaken the weapon that sleeps in the ruins, and you are the key that can break the lock and bring balance once more. And Jack pulled his hand away and fell to one knee, breathing like he had run 1,000 miles. Lyra knelt beside him, and a hand rested on his back like a steady flame, and she said, I know it hurts to be chosen, but some people are not given peace until they finish what began long ago. And Jack looked at her and asked if she really believed he could do this, and she said, I have believed since the day you made the joke and never looked back. The ship arrived above her planet, and Jack looked down at a world he remembered only in dreams and broken memories, and the green hills and crystal lakes looked peaceful from above. But Lyra said, the enemy lives in the shadows and hides beneath the beauty, and the danger is growing every day. As they landed in a hidden base deep in the forest, Lyra showed him the map carved into the floor of a temple, and it was older than both of them and filled with names written in a language Jack did not understand, but somehow his hand moved over the markings like he had seen them before. A small group of her people entered and looked at Jack with mixed eyes, and one of the elders stepped forward and said, the prophecy warned us, and now we see it is true. The human has returned with the mark of the relic and must now walk the path that leads to the awakening. Jack felt their eyes like pressure against his skin, and he said, I am not a hero, and I never was. And the elder replied, then be something better. Be the man who keeps a promise and protects, not because he is chosen, but because he is chosen, but because he chooses. Lyra led Jack into the lower chambers of the temple, where glowing roots wrapped the walls, and the air smelled like rain and time, and at the center was a sealed door covered in symbols, and Lyra said, the weapon sleeps behind this door, and only you can wake it. Jack raised the hand again, and the door reacted with a low hum and slowly opened, revealing a large room filled with light and floating stones, and a great machine that looked like a sleeping giant made of metal and memory, and in the center was a seat shaped like a hand waiting to be claimed. He turned to Lyra and said, what happens if I sit? And she said, everything changes. The stars watched through cracks in the ceiling, and the machine stirred as if sensing him, and the silence was no longer silence. It was the moment before thunder, the breath before the storm. Jack stepped forward and the light grew brighter and the machine began to wake, and somewhere deep inside him the joke that was never a joke whispered again, and his promise echoed through the stars. The machine began to breathe like a sleeping beast, and the room filled with a low hum that wrapped around Jack's chest like a warning, and Lyra stepped back with her eyes wide and her breath slow as if the air had grown thick and ancient. Voices whispered behind the walls where no one should be. Jack placed his hand on the glowing seat, and the air cracked with light, and the floating stones turned slowly in a circle, and strange symbols appeared on the floor, shining with colors he had never seen before, and the chamber felt alive like it had been waiting for this moment for 1,000 years. Then something shifted. A scream came from the entrance of the temple, and a blast of heat rolled through the corridor, and Lyra moved fast, pulling Jack away from the machine, and he turned in time to see shadow figures racing through the door with weapons that hummed like poison and armor that reflected nothing. They moved like ghosts but struck like thunder, and the first one reached for Jack with a blade shaped like fear, and Lyra blocked it with a shield of light that cracked under the force and shattered into sparks, and Jack grabbed a fallen staff and swung it hard, and the shadow fell back with a hiss like burning metal. Attackers were not outsiders but her own people, dressed in the robes of the temple, and their eyes glowed red like something ancient had taken hold of them, and one of them shouted words in a forgotten tongue, and the machine behind Jack roared with energy like it recognized an enemy. Lyra shouted, "They are the broken ones," and Jack asked who turned them, and she said, "They follow the old fire and believe the weapon must never awaken, and their minds have been poisoned by fear in the past, and they will burn the future to protect what should stay dead." Jack and Lyra fought back to back through the sacred halls, and the lights flickered above them, and the air turned cold and sharp like the breath of a dying world, and each strike felt heavier and each sound louder. As the battle moved deeper into the temple, they reached the outer chamber where a hidden door slid open, revealing a long passage filled with carvings, and at the end a single figure stood waiting with a calm smile and a voice that felt like it knew Jack's name before he was born. The man stepped forward, tall and cloaked in dark silver, and his eyes held no color, and he said, "So the human has returned to play hero in a story he does not understand." And Lyra whispered his name with fear in her voice, and Jack asked who he was, and she said he was once a guardian but now walks with shadows, and his name is Malik. Malik said the promise should have been forgotten and the stars should have left the past in silence, and Jack said, "Then why do you fear it so much?" And Malik laughed like breaking glass and said, "I fear nothing, but I will not let you open the gate that will destroy us." Jack asked what gate, and Malik raised his hand, and light poured from the walls, showing a vision of the weapon in full form, rising above planets and tearing fleets in half with waves of light. And he said, "This is not a tool of peace, this is judgment carved in steel, and it remembers pain more than hope." Lyra stepped forward and said, "It is not the weapon that destroys, it is the hands that guide it." And Malik turned to her and said, "You were a child who believed in fairy tales, and now you risk everything for a joke spoken by a broken man in a cave." Jack looked at Lyra and saw the fire in her eyes and said, "Maybe I was broken and maybe it was a joke, but it gave her hope, and that means something." And Malik's smile faded into cold silence as he raised a blade shaped like a crescent moon, and the ground shook beneath him. The shadows returned from the halls behind, and Jack knew they were surrounded, but he also knew something had changed inside him, and he was no longer just a man who had survived. He was now a man who remembered why he had fought in the first place. He took a deep breath and stepped toward Malik and said, "I did not come to awaken destruction. I came to keep a promise, and I will not walk away again." Malik's blade moved, but so did the machine behind them, and a light shot through the roof, and the temple roared with power, and the walls began to shift and crumble as ancient systems woke from sleep and recognized both Jack and the threat before him. The machine's voice filled the chamber and said, "Threat detected, judgment pending." And Malik's face turned pale for the first time, and he stepped back into shadow as the ceiling began to collapse. Lyra grabbed Jack's arm and pulled him through the side tunnel as fire and dust filled the sacred room, and the last thing Jack saw was the machine's light flaring like a second sun in the dark. They ran through stone and time as the past fell behind them and the future waited ahead, and the promise was not forgotten. The tunnel curved like the inside of a forgotten dream, and every step felt heavier as if the air itself was testing Jack's strength. And Lyra walked beside him with quiet fear in her eyes, and the walls glowed with soft blue veins like the planet itself was watching their path in silence. They had escaped the shadows but not the danger, because ahead of them was something older than machines and deeper than weapons. And Lyra spoke without sound and pointed to a door made of crystal and light, and Jack stepped forward with a breath that shook his bones, and the door melted away like morning fog inside. The room was no enemy and no blade, only light and memory, floating like mist, and a voice echoed through the chamber, not from a speaker, not from a machine, but from inside Jack's mind, as if his own thoughts had turned against him. And the voice said, "You made a promise in laughter, and now we ask if your heart can hold it in truth." Jack looked around and saw himself as a soldier, younger and full of fire, screaming orders on a broken battlefield, and then he saw himself running from pain, hiding from guilt, drinking silence and forgetting joy in the visions twisted through the air like ribbons of smoke pulling at his mind. Like gravity, the voice said, you cannot lead others if you do not know your own shadow, and you cannot protect another world if you cannot face your own. Lyra stood at the edge of the light, unable to move forward, as if the room had drawn a line only Jack could cross, and she whispered his name, but the wind took it away like it was never spoken, and Jack stepped deeper into the chamber and the floor disappeared into Stasi. Stood now in space with no helmet and no ship, and yet he could breathe and think and feel everything around him like it was inside him, and before him floated three figures, all wearing his face. One was the boy who first held a weapon, one was the man who laughed in the cave, one was the broken soul who stopped believing. The voice said, one of these truths will guide you, the others will break you, and you must choose not with logic, not with strength, but with the heart that made a promise. Long ago the first Jack said, fight until the end and burn before you bow, and the second Jack said, laugh through the pain and never look back, and the third Jack said, run from love and hide behind peace, because peace hurts less when you expect nothing. Jack closed his eyes and reached deep, not into memory but into feeling, and he remembered Lyra's eyes when she was young and full of wonder, and he remembered her hand in his when the shadows came, and he remembered her voice saying, I believed in you even when the stars forgot. He opened his eyes and stepped toward the second Jack and said, I was broken but not blind, and I laughed because it was the only thing left, but I meant every word, and I will not forget that. Again the other figures faded into dust, and the stars turned gold, and the chamber returned, and the floor returned, and Lyra was there with tears on her face like crystal rain, and the voice said, your heart has chosen, and the gate is now yours. A beam of light shot from the ceiling and wrapped around Jack's arm like a ribbon of fire, and a mark appeared glowing with the symbol of the relic, and Lyra stepped forward and touched it, and said, the weapon will listen to you now, because it sees what I saw long ago. The crystal behind them cracked and opened and revealed a path of light leading to the control chamber deep beneath the surface, and the machine waited at the center of it like a god carved from memory and steel, and it spoke with a voice that felt like thunder inside. Water, it said, the heart has passed the test, and the choice is now yours. Bring peace or bring fire. And Jack said, I choose to protect, and I choose to keep the promise that began not with war but with kindness. And the machine lowered its core and accepted the command. Lyra placed her hand on the side of the machine and closed her eyes and whispered to the stars, and Jack looked at her and felt something he could not name, something between love and purpose, something that made every step worth the pain. Outside, the shadows gathered again, and Malik stood on a distant ridge watching the light rise from the mountain, and his eyes narrowed, and he whispered, so the human has awakened the heart. But the war is not done, not yet. The stars moved above the world, and the machine woke fully, and the ground began to shift, and the ancient network of defense stirred like a beast called from sleep. And far beyond the sky, something dark approached, but inside the chamber, Jack stood ready, not as a hero, not as a soldier, but as a man who kept a promise. And the stars remembered. The light of the machine rose through the mountain like a second sun, and across the sky clouds moved like torn paper, and the air turned electric with the weight of old power waking from its long sleep. And Jack stood in the center of the chamber with fire running through his veins and the relic burning on his arm like a living flame. Lyra stood beside him with her hand still pressed to the machine, and her voice spoke to the systems in her native tongue, and the metal around them answered with movement and sound as the walls shifted and the room opened to reveal a wide view of the sky where ships began to appear like shadows swimming through storm. Jack stepped forward as the platform lifted them higher, and the wind hit his face with the cold truth of war returning, and in the distance he saw Molech's fleet breaking through the clouds like thunder with wings, and below them the forests burned with red flame and smoke curled toward the stars. The machine spoke again in the voice of the ancients, and it said, defense systems activated, targeting locked, awaiting command. And Jack looked at Lyra, who nodded without fear, and said, this is your fight now, not for destruction, not for revenge, but for protection of life that still hopes. He raised his arm, and the symbol on his skin pulsed once, and the machine answered with a sound like drums, and light spread across the mountain as towers rose from the earth, and shields formed in the sky, and weapons hidden 4 generations pointed toward the enemy above. The first blast came from the sky, a beam of energy that tore through the trees and left a scar across the ground, but the shield held, and the impact faded like a scream swallowed by silence. And Jack clenched his fists and said, we hold this line. And Lyra said, we are not alone. Across the valleys others rose with them, warriors of her people, riding ships shaped like wings and carrying blades that hummed with memory and old strength, and they flew into battle without fear with the promise of survival burning in their hearts. Jack entered the command circle where a projection of the battlefield lit the air, and every movement of his hand sent orders through the system, and he directed the ancient weapons like a conductor guiding stars into song, and each blast that fired was a word of defiance spoken against the darkness. The enemy came in waves, dark ships moving like insects swarming the light, and Malik's voice echoed through the channel, filled with cold laughter, and he said, you woke a god to fight a devil, but the stars will not choose sides, they only watch as fire consumes the future. Jack answered with silence and fire, and every decision felt like a step across a tightrope above a storm, and he knew one mistake could break everything, but he also knew this was the place he was meant to be, not running, not hiding, but standing in the promise he had once made in the middle of peace and laughter. The sky burned as both sides clashed above the mountains, and the sound of war returned, not as chaos but as rhythm, and Jack moved with purpose, and every time a ship fell, he felt the weight, and every time a shield broke, he felt the risk, and every time Lyra looked at him, he felt the reason. Then the core of the machine shook, and a warning echoed across the command circle saying enemy breach detected, lower chamber compromised, and Jack turned to Lyra, who looked down with fear as a red mark spread across the map like a wound opening inside the mountain. Moloch had sent his shadows through the roots of the world, while the sky was burning, and now they were inside, moving fast and deadly toward the heart of the machine, and if they reached it, the weapon would fall, and the shield would die, and nothing would stop the end. Jack ran with Lyra beside him through twisting halls and golden circuits pulsing on the walls, and each corner they turned brought closer the sound of battle below, and when they reached the heart chamber, they found the shadows already there, blades in hand and eyes glowing with madness. Malik himself stood at the center, his hand raised toward the core, and his voice spoke in a language older than war and darker than silence, and the light of the room bent around him like it was afraid, and Jack stepped forward with no fear and said, I made a promise not just to her but to this world, and I will not break it now. The fight was not clean, it was fire and dust and light and screams, and Jack moved like a storm with Lyra beside him, each strike filled with memory and meaning, and together they reached the core, and Malik turned with a blade of shadow in hand, but Jack blocked it with the mark glowing on his arm, and the two forces clashed like gods from two forgotten books. Malik fell back, wounded by the light of the promise, and the machine sealed the chamber with a final wave of power, and the mountain shook as the last of the enemy ships began to fall from the sky like dying stars, and the light of the machine covered the world like dawn after the longest night. Jack looked at Lyra with sweat and blood on his face, and she smiled through tears and said, We are still here. And Jack nodded as the silence returned, not empty but full of meaning. The war had returned, and now it had passed, and the stars had watched, and the promise still lived. The sky above the mountain turned soft with golden light, and the smoke from the battle drifted like old dreams into the wind, and the sounds of war faded into memory as if the world itself was trying to heal, and the machine at the heart of the mountain rested once more, silent and calm, and watching. Jack walked through the quiet forest with slow steps and tired eyes, and each breath felt heavy but peaceful, and the mark on his arm no longer burned but glowed gently like a candle that would never go out, and around him the trees whispered and the air smelled like life instead of fire. Lyra waited near the river where the light touched the water like silver, and her face was calm, but her eyes held something deeper, something quiet and powerful like the ocean waiting beneath the stars. And when Jack stepped closer, she smiled, and the whole world seemed to breathe with her. He sat beside her with no words for a moment, and the silence between them felt full like a story told without sound. And Lyra placed a small stone into the river and said, This is a tradition we do when the world changes. We give something to the water so it carries the memory forward. Jack picked up a stone smooth and dark and held it in his hand and said, I never thought a joke would lead me here. And Lyra looked at him with a softness that felt older than time and said, I never thought a promise would save my world, but you kept. I placed the stone in the water and watched it disappear beneath the surface, and the river carried it away like a secret now, safe and free, and the wind moved gently through the trees, as if the planet was finally at peace, and the stars above began to shine again without fear. A gathering formed near the base of the mountain where Lyra's people stood in a circle with lights in their hands, and they sang in a language Jack did not know but could feel in his chest, and every note sounded like forgiveness and hope and the future calling. The elders stepped forward and thanked Jack, not as a warrior, not as a savior, but as someone who chose to protect even when the stars were falling. And one elder placed a chain around his neck with a crystal that pulsed with light and said, This is not for power, this is for truth. Lyra took his hand and led him through the circle, and no one bowed and no one shouted, because respect here was quiet and deep and filled with meaning, and Jack felt something in his heart settle like a ship finally reaching shore. That night they stood on a hill above the valley where lights from the village danced like fireflies and the moon cast silver across the fields, and Jack looked at Lyra and said, What happens now? And she said, Whatever we choose, because the story, it is still ours to write. He asked if she remembered everything from that day in the cave, and she nodded and said, I remember the way you smiled. I remember the way you smiled. I remember the way you said it like it was just for fun, but I knew even then that words shaped stars. Jack looked at her with something in his eyes that had no name, and he said, I was broken that day, but you gave me something back, and I did not know how much I needed it until now. She stepped closer and placed her forehead against his, and the air between them felt like light and warmth and promise, and she whispered so softly that only he could hear it, and she said, I grew up waiting not for a wedding, not for a ceremony, but for youth. Stars above seemed to pause in their journey, and the night held them like a secret, and Jack took her hands and said, I never believed in forever until I met you, and if you still want to marry a lost human from a noisy planet, I would say yes now without a joke. Lyra laughed like the first time in the cave, and her eyes filled with joy and memory, and she said, I never stopped wanting that, and now I choose it with my whole heart. And the night wrapped around them like a cloak made of hope and time. In the days that followed, they built a new home at the edge of the valley where the river curved like a smile, and Jack helped plant seeds with his hands, and Lyra sank to the soil and the plants grew fast and full, and each day felt like a gift wrapped in peace. The machine stayed silent deep in the mountain, but its light still watched, and the people who once feared the stars now welcomed them, and travelers began to arrive from other worlds, curious and open and no longer afraid. Jack sometimes stood at the edge of the field and looked at the sky and remembered Earth and the war and the silence of being lost. And now when he looked beside him and saw Lyra smiling or laughing or planting or sleeping, he knew that the promise had not only been kept, it had grown, and somewhere across the galaxy a star burned brighter, as if it remembered a little alien girl and a human who once made her laugh in a cave, because a joke is forgotten when it is only words, but a promise, say promise, remembers.